at the humane punishment of criminals. When it opened nearly 170 years ago, it was hailed throughout the world as an architectural marvel and a model for prison reform. Its founders were attempting a radical social experiment where inmates would be confined to their cells for their entire sentence, serving their time in total isolation and absolute silence. The sinners would be left only with a Bible and their inner thoughts, free to return to their innate goodness. And from this goal of penitence, the word penitentiary was born. But over time, idealism collided with reality, and Eastern State evolved into a nightmarish holding pen for notorious names like Al Capone and Willie Sutton. It became the scene of daring escapes, bloody riots, and gruesome murders.
If you come in and you kept your nose clean and didn't do this and didn't do that, you had no problems. But if somebody told me what they're going to do to me, I say, sorry, buddy, I come from the same neighborhood as you. I'll break every bone in your... And I meant it.
They'll try to act like tough guys. And I used to say, don't put your gorilla suit on. Because if you try it, you got to wear it all the time, and I don't think you're that bad. There's a lot of bad people in here that will knock your head off in a minute if you jump in their face.
They had blood all over the place. They had blood in this corner, the walls were covered with blood. The floor, the wall, and all, the yards were covered with blood, and they wouldn't wash it down for 3 or 4 days to make sure everybody saw the blood.
But despite all the problems, Eastern States leaders always maintained their good intentions and struggled to strike a balance between reform and retribution, between punishment and brutality, and between rehabilitation and driving men insane. The humane punishment of criminals. Until the 1700s, the concept was of little concern. Punishment of lawbreakers usually consisted of public humiliation, banishment, mutilation, torture, or the gallows. The idea of serving time as punishment had not yet been developed. Jails were filthy holding pens for criminals waiting to be tried or to receive their punishment. All types of criminals were thrown together in these dungeons, making jails schools for vice, where petty criminals learned from the hardened inmates. Little provision was made for the care and feeding of convicts, and disease was rampant. Typhus, or jail fever, was a common killer of prisoners.
When these prisoners were brought to court, they infected juries and judges and the police. And so there was quite a bit of alarm. And the thrust now was to clean up the prisons.
The man often called the father of prison reform is the Englishman John Howard. In the 1770s, he toured Europe's jails and called for cleaning up the prisons. He concluded that it is essential for all prisoners to have separate rooms for hours of thoughtfulness and reflection. However, while inspecting a jail in Russia, Howard too contracted jail fever and died in 1790. In America, the Pennsylvania Quakers were at the forefront of prison reform. Colonial Governor William Penn had himself been imprisoned in England for his religious beliefs. He dedicated himself to creating a more humane method of punishment by imposing prison sentences and eliminating the death penalty. In 1776, a group of prominent Pennsylvania citizens founded the Philadelphia Society for Alleviating the Miseries of Public Prisons. Members included such influential leaders as Benjamin Franklin and Dr. Benjamin Rush. They studied John Howard and espoused the Quaker ideal of man's innate goodness. They felt that total solitude combined with labor and religious study would reform prisoners. They lobbied for the construction of a large new penitentiary designed and built specifically to carry out this experimental philosophy.
The request for proposals went out, and this was a competition for a $100 prize to design the Eastern State Penitentiary. And it finally came down to two architects, William Strickland and John Haviland. And the younger, lesser-known architect, John Haviland, won the commission and got the $100 prize for his design.
Haviland's blueprint called for 250 cells arranged in 7 cell blocks. These hallways would be built as spokes radiating from a central hub. This floor plan would provide a convenient viewing area to keep watch on the entire prison. The cornerstone was laid on May 22, 1823, on a site known as Cherry Hill, about 2 miles outside the city. The project would take 13 years to complete, but when it was finished, the prison would stand as the largest public structure in the United States.
By the 1820 standards, Eastern State Penitentiary is absolutely massive. It's nearly 11 acres on the inside of the walls. The outside walls are half a mile around. They are 30 feet high and 8 feet thick at the base. And so this was said to be the most expensive building in the United States at the time that it opened, at a cost of $770,000.
On October 25, 1829, while many of the cell blocks were still under construction, inmate number 1 was led to his cell. He was an 18-year-old farmer by the name of Charles Williams, sentenced to 2 years for stealing a $20 watch, a $3 gold seal, and a gold key. Eastern State's founders were unwavering in their commitment to the humanity and effectiveness of their methods and adopted painstaking measures to ensure the isolation of the prisoners. When a new inmate arrived, a black hood was placed over his head and he was led to his cell. The hood prevented the convict from knowing the prison's layout and kept him from seeing or being seen by other inmates. Once locked in the cell, he remained there for the duration of his sentence. The cells were relatively large, 7.5 feet by 12 feet, allowing the prisoner room to work on crafts like weaving or shoemaking. Each cell was equipped with a flush toilet and central heating. Eastern State was the first large-scale building in the country to include these amenities. The cell bars were covered with heavy oak doors, and meals were delivered through a small feeding hole. Each cell had a tiny skylight for ventilation, and, weather permitting, the inmate could exercise for 1 hour a day in an outdoor yard adjoining his cell. Absolute silence was to be maintained. Prisoners would receive no letters or family visits, and they were to speak only with religious or vocational counselors. The precautions taken to assure silence were extreme. Pipes for the plumbing ran into the hallways so jailers could detect inmates tapping messages to one another. Guards were instructed to wear socks over their shoes to keep their footsteps muffled, and the food carts all had leather padding on their wheels. The jailers only allowed inmates to exercise in alternate yards, so there could never be communication with the prisoners in the next cells. By 1831, it became obvious that the new prison wasn't going to be large enough, so cell blocks 4 through 7 were redesigned to be two-story structures. This increased the capacity to 450 cells, but it prevented the upper tier from having the outdoor yards, so the adjacent cells were used for exercise. The prison's underlying philosophy and message was also translated to the facade of the building.
From a distance, it has a foreboding, medieval feel to it. In fact, the architect even put fake arrow-slit windows all across the front facade to give it a sense of a castle or a dungeon-like appearance. It has battlements across the top and an intentionally very frightening facade. It's a building designed to intimidate. The message is very clear. It's supposed to strike fear into the hearts of anyone who would consider committing a crime. The interesting thing about that to me is that the United States was only 50 years old at the time and was defining itself as being quite different from its European predecessors. This was the world's first true democracy since ancient times, and yet the major building project of the day looks like a castle out of Scotland, and it's designed to evoke all the images of a monarchy with a powerful government, a government that doesn't have to answer to the will of the people, designed to create the image of dungeons and torture.
The new reform movement became known throughout the world as the Pennsylvania System, with Eastern State Penitentiary as the instrument to punish and rehabilitate criminals. During the first 4 years of operation, more than 200 inmates were admitted to Eastern State. The most common offenses were larceny, burglary, and horse theft. At the time, there were no prisons for young offenders, and among the early inmates was a 12-year-old boy convicted of arson. Also included with the first inmates were 4 women convicts. The penitentiary would continue to house female prisoners until 1923.
We have also at least 2 different documented stories of babies being born here. And they were allowed to stay with their mothers for a period of time. And then both of them were sent home with other female prisoners until mother completes her sentence.
The remarkable new prison soon became one of Philadelphia's most popular tourist attractions, eclipsing even Independence Hall.
If you came to Philadelphia in the 1830s, 1840s, one of the main places you'd want to see would be the Eastern State Penitentiary. And about 10,000 tourists at its peak would come up from the city of Philadelphia in horse and buggy and tour this architectural marvel. People wanted to see the building for its scale, for its revolutionary mechanical systems, and for this new system of holding inmates in isolation.
In 1842, a young Charles Dickens embarked on his first trip to America. He said the 2 things he most wanted to see in the United States were Niagara Falls and Eastern State Penitentiary. Dickens toured the prison and was allowed to interview inmates. He was highly critical of the isolation system, writing, "I hold this slow and daily tampering with the mysteries of the brain to be immeasurably worse than any torture of the body." The prison supporters were outraged at Dickens' accounts and were quick to point out the inconsistencies in the stories of inmates he interviewed. One prisoner who Dickens claimed had been damaged by the system later wrote a book of poetry and proudly proclaimed, "I regard my confinement at Eastern State to be the happiest event of my life. It has improved my mind and made me better at heart. Whatever reformation my imprisonment may have produced can be attributed to the separate seclusion from evil example." But in reality, there were serious problems with the Pennsylvania system, the evidence was growing that isolation was psychologically damaging. Eastern State's 1838 annual report noted 18 cases of insanity, although the report tried to defuse the problem by claiming 12 of the illnesses were actually due to excessive masturbation.
At the time the prison opened, the medical profession in Europe and in this country were very concerned about the long-term effects of masturbation, or self-abuse as they tended to call it. They thought it has very, very serious consequences. And the guards used all their ingenuity to catch inmates in the act.
In practice, the purity of the Pennsylvania system was virtually impossible to maintain. Many inmates were out of their cells working in construction and maintenance as kitchen help and even as servants for the warden. In 1832, one of the warden's waiters, William Hamilton, became the first escapee.
One night, that inmate got the warden's bed sheets, tied them together in a rope, gathered up the warden's silverware, threw his rope over the wall, and escaped. He was caught a few days later, given his job as servant back again by the warden. A few weeks later, he did the exact same thing, escaped again with the bed sheets over the wall and the warden's silverware again. He was also caught that time too.
The prison was also rocked with scandal from the start. Although the theory was to eliminate corporal punishment, an 1834 investigation revealed that prisoners who tried to communicate with others or refused to work were subjected to tortures like the straitjacket or the iron gag. Inmate Matthias McCumsey was accidentally strangled to death by this torture device. The investigation also revealed wild parties with heavy drinking in the administration building. These raucous events were disguised as quilting parties. Accusations centered on Mrs. Richard Blunden, the wife of a guard. She reportedly had hosted the parties and was even reputed to have had sexual relations with the warden as well as several inmates. She was known to be a vulgar woman who later threatened the warden, claiming she would flog that damn Quaker SOB and knock every tooth down his throat. Overcrowding led to further breakdown of the system, making isolation extremely difficult. By 1841, it even became necessary to house 2 inmates in many cells. Beginning in 1877, 4 new cell blocks were built between the first 7, but none of these had outdoor exercise yards. Mirrors had to be installed in the hallways so guards could look down blocks 8 and 9. Officials tried to hide the prison's problems, but by the late 1800s, the solitary system was in shambles. Meanwhile, a rival prison system was gaining worldwide support. New York State's Congregate or Auburn system, named after the prison that first introduced it. It also demanded silence, but inmates were allowed out of their cells to work in factories. Although these prisons relied on brutality to maintain control, they were less expensive to build, and their factories generated substantial income. By the turn of the century, Eastern was still officially an isolation prison, but they too were adopting congregate methods. In 1905, a factory building was squeezed in between cell blocks 5 and 6. Eventually, Block 4's exercise yards were enclosed to create a group mess hall. The Pennsylvania system had been disintegrating for decades, and finally, in 1913, it was officially abandoned. But for the prisoners who took part in this grand experiment, the effects proved to be both negative and positive.
the things that were wrong with the prisons at the time: disorder, riots, victimization, selling contraband. All these things were dealt with. If you were in a cell by yourself, you couldn't be attacked by inmates. You couldn't buy contraband. So in that respect, I think the prison was successful. In terms of sending out people who are reformed, this prison probably didn't do much better than other prisons at the time.
Eastern State Penitentiary would now be forced to redefine itself and find a way to become more like other prisons while furthering the idealism that had inspired its founders. The first decades of the 20th century began a new era in American prison reform. Eastern State now placed its focus on the psychological well-being of inmates and group programs to aid in inmate rehabilitation. Isolation was used only as punishment, with rule breakers thrown in the hole, more properly known as solitary confinement. Inmate activities now included classroom study and library visits. The prison orchestra was established, and for the first time, religious study was allowed outside the cells. And of course, there was group recreation, even including an inmate baseball league. However, the inmate newspaper named The Umpire warned the prisoners not to abuse their newfound privileges. A 1913 article urged them not to make too much noise at the baseball games because neighbors outside the walls might think they were having too much fun in prison. Products and crafts the prisoners manufactured in the new industrial shops were sold to the public, and the inmates were allowed to keep the profits. A lucrative market was created for items stamped "Convict Made."
One of the features of inmate craft work was a virtual franchise phenomenon, and the institution gave sanction to possession of a franchise to make, for instance, the boats. And as you were leaving, either being transferred to another institution or being discharged on parole, you would sell your franchise to another inmate. When the institution was first audited by the state, the inmate who handled the furniture shop in 1927, I believe it was, made more money than the warden did. The warden's salary at that time was about $8,000, and this inmate made more than $20,000.
By the 1930s, Prohibition was having its effect on prisons, and Eastern's population swelled to more than 1,700 inmates. The number one offense was murder, and by now, the felon population included only one horse thief. Certainly, Eastern State's most unusual inmate was admitted in 1924. His name was Pep the dog. Reportedly, Pep killed Governor Gifford Pinchot's cat.
The governor and his wife were so incensed that the governor used his power as the chief magistrate of the state, as well as the chief executive, to sentence this dog to life imprisonment. And we have his admission photograph. This black Labrador with the paddle hanging around his neck saying C-2559.
To avoid bad publicity over the bizarre sentence, it appears the governor created a misinformation campaign to soften public outrage. A newspaper article from 1926 claims the governor actually donated his own dog to the prison to improve inmate morale.
So we don't know what the real story is, but what I can tell you from personal investigation is that Pep's number is skipped in the official roster of admissions.
In 1929, Eastern State's most infamous criminal was admitted, the notorious Chicago gangster Al Capone. Reportedly, Capone arranged to have himself arrested to hide out in prison after the St. Valentine's Day massacre. He and his bodyguard, Frank Klein, were picked up on a concealed weapons charge and sentenced to a year in prison. At Eastern State, they received unusually special treatment. Capone and Klein were given neighboring cells in an open area of the prison called Park Avenue. These were large cells with 2 skylights each. Reportedly, Capone's door was rarely locked. He was even allowed to decorate his cell with expensive amenities.
As far as we know, no one ever took a photograph of Capone's cell. However, a journalist from the Philadelphia Public Ledger came in and wrote a story about Capone's cell. And he describes Capone's oil paintings on the walls, and antique furniture, and a large oriental rug on the floor, and a cabinet radio. And Capone liked to sit in the cell and listen to waltzes on his radio while he was here.
We know from prison records that he donated funds to the athletic department, bought team uniforms. At one point, at a boxing match out in the yard, he and the warden appeared together in the ring, and the warden thanked him for all of his generosity.
On December 21st, 1929, Al Capone was released to return to Chicago and the crime empire he had left behind. Like all prisons, Eastern State had to deal with numerous escape attempts. During the 20th century, breakouts became more and more frequent, with new construction creating new hiding places. The most infamous was an elaborate tunnel escape in April of 1945. This breakout is often credited as the work of the flamboyant bank robber and escape artist Willie Sutton.
Willie Sutton, in his time, was a major celebrity. He was called the Gentleman Bandit. He was also known as Willie the Actor. His mode of operation for robbing banks was to go in, often in disguise, often as a policeman, and then rob the bank.
But the real mastermind behind this escape was a small-time thief named Clarence Kleindienst. Kleindienst was the complete opposite of Sutton. He was a shy man who stuttered. A stonemason by trade, he became a trusted worker on the prison maintenance team. He was allowed tools and wheelbarrows for his job of repairing the aging plaster and brickwork. Step 1 in his daring plan was a transfer to cell block 7.
At the end of cell block 7 is cell 68. Now, he got himself transferred down to cell 68 to fix it up, because at that point it was still a workroom or a storage room. Now, cell 68 is the closest cell to the outside walls in the entire prison. He had the idea that he was going to escape from Eastern State Penitentiary by digging a tunnel. Clarence Kleindienst went right into the wall right here. Now, originally these were all plaster walls. And what Kleindienst did as he was replastering the wall was he created a plaster hatchway right here, roughly in the dimensions of this concrete slab right here. And he had it arranged so that he could cover the seams with a mixture of Vaseline and dirt so they blended in very nicely. He also had a little hook that he was able to insert into the wall to pull it out. And then he would just set the panel aside and start to work. Now, while Kleindienst was underground working on his tunnel, he needed to look like he was actually up here in the cell. And that's where William Russell, his cellmate, helped him out a lot. William Russell was kind of an artist and did a very realistic-looking bust of Clarence Kleindienst. Now, at night, while Kleindienst was underground in the tunnel, the bunk was right here. What Russell would do is put Kleindienst's head on a pillow, stuff some other pillows in there, and make the blankets look as if somebody was sleeping in there. Then Russell would sit on his bunk over here and talk to the fake Kleindienst, as if there were actually 2 men in the cell. So guards walking by outside would glance in here, they'd see a figure in this bed, they'd see a figure in this bed, and there was a conversation happening, and they'd just keep on walking as if everything looked normal.
Kleindienst got rid of the stone by dispersing it among his projects around the prison, while his cellmate trickled earth down the toilet. While Kleindienst toiled underground, the two inmates in the neighboring cell, Freddy Tenuto and Bocci Van Sant, stood guard. Progress was excruciatingly slow, but for 18 months, Kleindienst persevered. He rigged the tunnel with electric lights and shored it up with wood. Cell 68 was searched numerous times, but the tunnel was never found. It eventually stretched over 100 feet. Finally, around midnight of April 21st, Kleindienst broke through the ground on the outside of the wall. He rushed back to the cell and told Russell it was time to make the break. They would have a night's head start on the guards. But Russell refused to leave without Tenuto and Van Sant.
So Kleindienst, why we never know, stays too and waits till the next morning.
Meanwhile, Willie Sutton had suspected a breakout was being planned, and he demanded to be let in on the escape. The next morning at 7 a.m., Kleindienst and his team, as well as Sutton and several others who also learned of the tunnel, emerged on a crowded Philadelphia street. 12 men fled through the tunnel, but this was not the ideal time for a breakout.
Willie Sutton started running. He was immediately started being chased by the police because he was the most recognizable criminal. He also had what looked like a gun. During the time when he was in Eastern State, he had carved a very realistic-looking .45 automatic, and he had that with him. So the police went after him. A short gun battle ensued in which Willie Sutton can't fire back, so he gives up. Willie Sutton was the first one caught after 15 minutes.
Clarence Kleindienst's freedom lasted just 2 hours. Tenuto and Van Sant made it all the way to New York, but they were recaptured after 7 weeks.
Eventually, all of the inmates were brought back to Eastern State Penitentiary. One of the most interesting ones was a gentleman named William Grace, who came along near the end of the escape. Now, Grace didn't have any place to go. He didn't know Philadelphia very well, so he was hiding out in Fairmount Park, stealing newspapers off of people's stoops and milk to stay alive. He couldn't go anyplace. He couldn't get out of town, so he actually walked back to the prison at 5 in the morning and knocked on the front door and asked to be let back in.
For years to follow, Willie Sutton, who had nothing to do with the tunnel, always took credit for masterminding the escape, while the shy Kleindienst would refuse to talk about it. Sadly for Clarence Kleindienst, at the time of the escape, he had just 6 months left on his sentence. After he was captured, they added another 15 years. Many years had passed since Eastern State had sat alone on the hill, miles outside of Philadelphia. For the residents surrounding the walls, the prison had become part of the neighborhood. Tom Finn grew up in the shadow of the prison and signed on as a guard in 1957. Many of the inmates he guarded were once his neighbors.
When I come in, there was 9 guys that I knew that I either knew them or I run with their older brothers. But one thing I made clear, ask for nothing and you get nothing. I told them, I didn't put you in here, you put yourself in. I leave after 8 hours.
We used to call the cell block officers by their first names, and they didn't resent it. And they knew our family problems, they knew everything about it. They knew us personally, as a result, they gave us a lot of leeway.
For the people who worked here, the prison always felt different from other institutions, more humane, more respectful. But Eastern was still a maximum security prison, and there was no shortage of violence. Richard Griffin started as a guard in 1953. He was also a local boy who made use of his street savvy in his work.
I was concerned, never frightened. And I had one inmate tell me one day, he says, I'm going to break every bone in your body. I said, how are you? I said, guess where I come from? I said, right outside the wall. and I'll break every bone in your body twice. You got that? He turned and walked away and never spoke to me, or I spoke to him since.
When we walked the cell block, the only thing that distinguished us from the inmate was our uniform. We carried no clubs, no weapons, or any of that, because if you got down the end of the block, it could be used against you. The inmates could jump you and use the club or a gun against you or anything. These are only some of the items that was confiscated. This here is a piece of steel sharpened down, but anything that was a knife or anything resembling that was always what they called a shank. This is a pair of scissors that was separated and taped to do some good damage. And the case is made out of a belt that they had for their pants. This was a nail that was bent and sharpened to a point with tape, and this acted as a handle, but where they could hold it and jab. This is a zip gun. It's a homemade job, and a leather pouch.
The most dramatic episode of inmate violence came in a 1961 riot when prisoners took control of the rotunda, stabbing a guard and holding 16 men hostage.
That happened on 8 Block. A guy wanted to pass a guitar to another inmate. Any officer opened up the cell, being a nice guy, to let the guitar in, and they pushed him in the cell, took the keys off him, and started opening all their buddies' cells. And then they just stormed the center.
State troopers were sent in to crush the uprising.
State troopers were terrific. That's by the way I'll put that. They didn't take no lip, no nothing.
I was here. I was on 8 Block at the time. The troopers were extremely rough. They can remember they had the batons this long, and they were cracking heads, and indiscriminately. Anybody out of the cell was considered in a riot. They had blood all over the place. They had blood in this corner. The walls were covered with blood. The floor, the wall, and all the yards were covered with blood, and they wouldn't wash it down for 3 or 4 days. Make sure everybody saw the blood. As a lesson, you know, just what happens.
But extreme violence was the exception, not the rule, and day-to-day problems were far more tame.
Only trouble we had was with booze and sex. But we kept it to a minimum. And, see, I worked in a bake shop, and my main job was don't let no yeast get out of your sight, no way, shape, or form. And that's what they use it for. That was booze. One day I was up in the supply room, and I said, let me see if anything's going wrong in here. And sure enough, I picked up his box, which read paper contents. I said, oh. I picked it up, I almost sprained my wrist. It was about 40 pounds. And here it was 40 gallons of wine. Best wine in the world. They used to put lye in it. Oh, yeah.
But perhaps the most difficult time at Eastern State, or any prison, was always in the first months when new inmates and staff were tested by the hardened convicts. Dick Fulmer was a 22-year-old social worker, and Eastern was his first prison experience.
I was tested after 3 months here, and I was told that the inmate in the very last cell wanted to talk to me. So I walked back to the very last cell. I said, "You wanted to see me?" And he came up to the door and said, very quietly, in prison language, which I won't use, he said, "I want to have anal intercourse with you." And I went, blah, 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 and I got out of there. And all the way out from the very last cell, everybody knew what had happened, what he'd said to me. So it was always, woo, look at that walk. Hee, chicky, 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 come on over here. You know, I'm next kind of thing. I was red as a beet and I was dying. I went straight to my supervisor. I said, do you know what happened to me? And I was in a panic. He said, Dick, there are two things you have to do right now. First is you have to realize that you're big and you're ugly, and it's taken them 3 months to get around to you. Were you better looking, they'd have gotten you the first week. Second is you got to go back there right now. You don't have to do anything, just show your face. Because if you don't go back there right now, you can never go back again, and you'll have to quit. You won't be effective in your job. So I went back. I have no recollection of going back. I don't know how far I went. I was just there. I'm sure it was just zip-zop. Let me out of here. But it was a test.
The correctional system has yet to settle on a definition for humane punishment. Perhaps, ultimately, the inmates must define it for themselves.
I read something years ago, I must have been a boy when I read this. 2 prisoners looked down through prison bars. One saw mud, one saw stars. I saw stars. I found humor in prison. I created humor in prison. I didn't walk around and hang dog, look, I'm in here, they caught me, I'm here, I'll pay my price. But I'm not gonna bitch about it. They done their job, I done what I had to do, they done their job.
In 1971, Eastern State Penitentiary was finally closed. More than 80,000 men had served their time there, and its radial design had inspired 300 prisons throughout the world. The building eventually fell into serious decay. There were proposals to redevelop the property, retaining the walls, but turning the cell blocks into condominium apartments or even a shopping mall. Ultimately, the prison was declared an historic monument, and today it is a thriving tourist attraction drawing over 20,000 visitors a year. They tour the cell blocks, they visit art exhibits, and they experience the legacy of a prison founded on humanity and good intentions. Gruesome murders.
If you come in and you kept your nose clean and didn't do this and didn't do that, you had no problems. But if somebody told me what they're going to do to me, I'd say, sorry, buddy, I come from the same neighborhood as you. I'll break every bone in your... And I meant it.
They'll try to act like tough guys. And I used to say, don't put your gorilla suit on. Because if you try it, you got to wear it all the time, and I don't think you're that bad. There's a lot of bad people in here that will knock your head off in a minute if you jump in their face.
They had blood all over the place. They had blood in this corner, the walls were covered with blood. The floor, the wall and all, the yards were covered with blood, and they wouldn't wash it down for 3 or 4 days to make sure everybody saw the blood.
But despite all the problems, Eastern State's leaders always maintained their good intentions and struggled to strike a balance between reform and retribution, between punishment and brutality, and between rehabilitation and... They studied John Howard and espoused the Quaker ideal of man's innate goodness. They felt that total solitude combined with labor and religious study would reform prisoners. they lobbied for the construction of a large new penitentiary designed and built specifically to carry out this experimental philosophy.
The request for proposals went out, and this was a competition for a $100 prize to design the Eastern State Penitentiary. And it finally came down to two architects, William Strickland and John Haviland. And the younger, lesser-known architect, John Haviland, won the commission and got the $100 prize for his design.
Haviland's blueprint called for 250 cells arranged in 7 cell blocks. These hallways would be built as spokes radiating from a central hub. This floor plan would provide a convenient viewing area to keep watch on the entire prison. The cornerstone was laid on May 22, 1823, on a site known as Cherry Hill, about 2 miles outside the city. The project would take 13 years to complete, but when it was finished, the prison would stand as the largest. The man often called the father of prison reform is the Englishman John Howard. In the 1770s, he toured Europe's jails and called for cleaning up the prisons. He concluded that it is essential for all prisoners to have separate rooms for hours of thoughtfulness and reflection. However, while inspecting a jail in Russia, Howard too contracted jail fever and died in 1790. In America, the Pennsylvania Quakers were at the forefront of prison reform. Colonial Governor William Penn had himself been imprisoned in England for his religious beliefs. He dedicated himself to creating a more humane method of punishment by imposing prison sentences and eliminating the death penalty. In 1776, a group of prominent Pennsylvania citizens founded the Philadelphia Society for Alleviating the Miseries of Public Prisons. Members included such influential leaders as Benjamin Franklin and Dr. Benjamin Rush. At the humane punishment of criminals. When it opened nearly 170 years ago, it was hailed throughout the world as an architectural marvel and a model for prison reform. Its founders were attempting a radical social experiment where inmates would be confined to their cells for their entire sentence, serving their time in total isolation and absolute silence. The sinners would be left only with the Bible and their inner thoughts, free to return to their innate goodness. And from this goal of penitence, the word penitentiary was born. But over time, idealism collided with reality, and Eastern State evolved into a nightmarish holding pen for notorious names like Al Capone and Willie Sutton. It became the scene of daring escapes, bloody riots, and driving men insane. The humane punishment of criminals. Until the 1700s, the concept was of little concern. Punishment of lawbreakers usually consisted of public humiliation, banishment, mutilation, torture, or the gallows. The idea of serving time as punishment had not yet been developed. Jails were filthy holding pens for criminals waiting to be tried or to receive their punishment. All types of criminals were thrown together in these dungeons, making jails schools for vice, where petty criminals learned from the hardened inmates. Little provision was made for the care and feeding of convicts, and disease was rampant. Typhus, or jail fever, was a common killer of prisoners.
When when these prisoners were brought to court, they infected juries and judges and the police. And so there was quite a bit of alarm. And the thrust now was to clean up the prison.